It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here at the Vienna School of International Study to our lecture on European foreign policy in times of populism, which we organized jointly with the Center for European Integration Research. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This Vienna lecture comes out of a larger research project, and we have many project collaborators here with us today from over 30 countries. So thank you so much again to all of you for coming to Vienna and for staying with us, and then of course to all the students and external guests. Let me briefly introduce our topic, EU foreign policy and populism. I think it's, in times of populism, it's a serious topic, and it sounds a bit like the famous novel Love in Times of Cholera from the Colombian Nobel Prize winning author Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But it's probably not fair to compare populism to something like cholera. There are some authors that say that populism actually also has good effects, or can have quite healthy effects in certain conditions on political systems. And then there are others who say that probably populism is something that has been there for a long time, and it comes in waves, and one should maybe not hype it too much or overtalk it.
And even if the European Union is going to be pushed to adopt a protectionist policy of its own, if others are going to do it, climate change is giving a language to do it without basically doing it in the way some of the other much more globalist players are doing this. And certainly, of course, this is a language that resonates strongly with a much younger population, not only in Europe, but also outside of Europe. So from this point of view, you try to make a public coalition at the base of it. I'm saying this, and I'm going to finish with the four choices which, in my view, the European Union basically is facing in this environment as to how to define itself and what kind of foreign policy it could be. And these choices are very kind of well now spelled. You can hear it from different corners of the Union. One is the idea of the European sovereignty that comes very much from the French president, Emmanuel Macron. And basically it goes that the European Union should have a strategic autonomy, that basically the European Union cannot rely anymore on the security umbrella coming from the United States. The nature of the transatlantic relations has been dramatically changed, and this is not simply based on the fact that Donald Trump is president of the United States. The idea is that even Donald Trump is not the president of the United States, the relations will not come back. For this to happen, many things should change, but one of the most important is that the European Union should become military self-sufficient. And here the problem of the European Union going beyond the idea of the soft and economic power, this is the suggestion on the French side that French nuclear powers should be Europeanized, and basically others, and particularly Germany, should invest in developing the nuclear capacities of France. The problem with this type of a suggestion, which makes a lot of sense on a high strategical level, is that when it comes to the security guarantees and the potential of the European Union to be an effective protector of the European interests and the interests of the nation states, different EU member states have different perspectives. And it is quite clear that some of the EU member states, particularly on the East, particularly countries like Poland, the Baltic countries, and others, they do believe first it's going to take time, secondly they don't see this protection too much reliable, so for the moment they're much more going to bet on the bilateral with the United States than to rely on the idea of the EU sovereignty. The second option, which paradoxically is the most liked by the European public opinion, is the European Union like the late Habsburg Empire, which means that the very existence and the policies of the EU should be guaranteed by all other major parties. There was just before the European elections, the European Council of Foreign Relations made a big survey of the public attitudes in 14 European Union member states, all major states, and quite a lot of East European countries. And here are two results that if you don't know, you're going to find interesting. One of the questions was what Europe should do in the case of a major clash between the United States and China. The majority of all 14 countries said we should remain neutral. We should remain neutral. The second was what the European Union should do in the case of a major clash between the United States and Russia. Majority of every single of the 14 EU member states, including Poland and Romania, declared we should remain neutral. The third result came from a very recent Pew Research, which was asking questions in different NATO member states. Should your country go into the defense of another NATO member states if they are going to be attacked by Russia? 43% of plurality of the polls said we should not do it. So what is interesting about the European public opinion is that suddenly, unlike normally, we basically identified populism as a much more aggressive foreign policy. And in many of the places, this is true. In many of the countries, you basically see the rise of the populist leaders that brings much more aggressive foreign policy. It also increases the likelihood, including of the war. One of the particularities of the European public opinion is, to put it bluntly, in the eyes of the public, European Union is a retired power. We don't want to be involved. We had our wars before. We want to be left alone. The problem with this kind of a Habsburg option is that not much depends on us. And I don't see a much kind of a possibility for the European Union at one and the same time to get the guarantees from China and the United States, which are in a major conflict with each other, and also basically from Russia to do it. So this option, which is the preferable options if you read public opinion polls, also is quite unrealistic when it comes to basically what is happening on the ground. There is a third option, and basically this is certain type of a reformulation of the Cold War alliance with the United States, but very much keeping the asymmetrical nature of the relationship, which was also typical of the Cold War. And this very much is seen in the way the 5G debate is going on. Basically, America and the United States is going to keep part of its security commitments to Europe, but at the same time, basically, the Europe should not have an autonomous role of its own. And if in the military sphere, this is not so difficult for Europe to basically make this bargain, this is very difficult in the trade area. Because the problem with the European Union is that when it comes to trade and the economy, it is a real superpower. So from this point of view, and this is why the Huawei and basically 5G debate is critically important, and in many respects, by the way, reminds in its importance the importance of the Marshall Plan debate just after the end of the World War II. I'm saying this because there is also the fourth option, and this is in a certain way post-EU option, in which in this type of a crisis, many believe that it's very difficult to have a common European foreign policy, so the different nation states are going to focus very much on their nation policies, and they're going to be a national sovereignty which is going to run it. But I'm going to end up on this. The problem with this option is that when it comes to some of the small European Union member states, and the German President Steinmeier had a good comment on this. He said, in Europe there are only two types of countries. Small countries that they know that they're small, and small countries that still don't know that they're small. So from this point of view, I cannot understand exactly what sovereignty means. How Bulgaria is going to be a sovereign actor in this global world. How we're going to have our sovereign policy with respect to China, Russia, the United States. How this is going to function in economic terms, political terms, and military terms. So with this kind of easy questions, I'm going to ask others to give the answers.
As Patrick introduced me, I'm the head of the Center for European Integration Research and an expert on EU policies and the comparison of EU policies. So I'm really not an expert per se on populist radical right parties. However, they do matter nowadays for EU policies, and they may matter even more in the future. So this is why I decided a couple of years ago to actually launch a project studying what the populist radical right parties in Europe actually say about EU policies and how they claim they want to reform EU policies, if at all. And so I'm happy to present here the results of a small research project I actually carried out with Georg Plattner, who was then a doctoral student of mine. And you can read out the results, for example, in the Journal of Common Market Studies. So what do they actually really say about EU policies? I'll tell you very briefly, our research design was to collect the programs for the latest elections for the European Parliament or the latest party programs. And we took on board all of the populist radical right parties that formed a part of the last European Parliament, so the 8th European Parliament, and belonged to a party federation that had at least 2 populist radical right parties, because our comparison was on all levels, within the party federations and amongst the parties. So what we didn't take on board was actually the Hungarian populist radical right, Fidesz. But you will say it doesn't matter too much, because the main finding of diversity is so strong a finding that it could hardly have been even stronger. So we made a very detailed social science study where we took each and every claim, so that is each statement where they said something about an EU policy, and we included the internal market, we included new cleavage policies, like equal opportunities, environmental policy, and foreign security and defense issues. And we coded them whether they went in the direction of extending the policy or rather dismantling the policy. And for those who are political scientists, you will now already have the names of Bauer and Knill in your mind, and that is actually one of the concepts we applied. So we ended up with approximately 500 claims, and that was difficult and a lot of work. We made our life easy. We did not say that populism is like pornography, but we said we actually take the definitions of other authors, and we can't establish ourselves who actually is populist radical right. So we went with Creasy and Mude and the well-established social science concept. So populist is those who believe they speak for that people. It's those who are radical in that they oppose some of the core features of liberal democracy. And they are at the same time right in that the main inequalities between people are portrayed to be something natural and nothing we or the state should do anything about. And the basic research question, as I already alluded to, was really about coherence. How coherent are those views? If we take a real look, nobody before us had actually done. Why is it interesting? I figure that if those parties actually opt for different directions, they must tend to block each other when it's about debating real policy reform, for example, at the EU level. Should they head in the same basic direction, but differ with regards to the speed and the extent, that should make for big debates, maybe then a solution, a compromise. Only if they go into the same direction and also with a similar, at least, intensity, then it should really be easy for those parties to find a compromise. And actually, this is something that many people in academia assume. Usually, authors speak about the populist radical right as if it actually indeed were a bloc. Clearly we also had hypotheses, and I will only now present the one that fits very well with the foreign policy and defense issues. So that's actually found in the literature that these parties should have a kind of principled nationalism, should actually not ever opt to Europeanize something. What did we find? I already jumped to the findings of our study? Well, this hypothesis, our hypothesis one, but it was a hypothesis taken from the literature, not invented by us. This hypothesis actually doesn't hold at all. It is true that in overall terms, across all policies, we found many more claims for dismantling. But we found a significant amount of claims that want to keep policies as they are, or even want to extend policies. And I'll tell you more about that soon. So I would say that a kind of principled nationalism is at best promoted by some of the populist radical right parties, but certainly not by all members of that party family. So, for example, specific instruments, even of foreign policy, are promoted by a number of the parties we studied, like missions. Yeah? Even the German AfD speaks out in some of their papers very positively about joint missions. And the same is true for the Italian Lega Nord, or Lega, as they call themselves now. Yeah, counterterrorism is mentioned by the Lithuanian PTT. Yeah. And even regarding common military procurement, again, the Italians have asked for an extension. And the Austrian FPÖ in the paper was very positive about the goal of specifying a common defense policy. You can explain it if you think about neutrality and what it means in the country, but still, yeah, it's an interesting claim. We present some detailed tables, which I cannot certainly rehash here, but I can tell you that if you look, for example, at the basic goal of developing a common defense policy, yeah, there is no unity. You find populist radical right parties that want to dismantle that goal of the European Union. Like, if you're with the defense policy, we have 10 claims, yeah, the Danish, the Finnish, for example. But you also have a claim for an extension, it's FPÖ, and you have a status quo claim, yeah, the Lithuanian. If we go for individual missions, it's the very same. You can almost always find a party against it and parties for it. So that is the main thing. And for any details, I would like to invite you to read it, because I guess it would be boring. I would rather like to go to more general things. And the more general level is still first within foreign policy and defense issues. I want to get to a very basic point, and that is the claims regarding the EU's geopolitical orientation. I mean, that is something really basic in foreign and defense policy. Who among the big actors do you actually want to align with? And we have one camp within those parties that is actually anti-Russia, but pro-NATO and pro-United States. And we have 4 very strong claims to that effect. Yeah? But on the other hand, we have a group that is rather pro-Russia and anti-NATO and anti-United States. And we also have at least 4 parties that very clearly fall into that camp. So actually, if you would perceive of the populist radical right, say in the European Parliament, as really one camp, they couldn't find an agreement even on that very, very basic issue. And I think that is interesting, and I think that is actually something that should be exploited much more by the other parties, both in terms of the media and how the populist radical right is sort of addressed, and also in strategic practical terms when it's about EU-level negotiations, because it should be rather easy to split them up if there is a focus on this. And I will end by a few remarks on a more general level and now leave, so to say, the policy area of foreign and security policy. I believe that these findings, and by the way, the split is even much stronger when it's about the internal market, another very basic project of European integration. Yeah? It's tremendous how some of those parties want to close all borders and take back all of competition law even, to the very regional, local level even, and others who want to improve and further liberalize the internal market. Okay, just so much on the splits. Now my point is that politicians at large could draw on such findings and could help to kind of disillusionize the broader public and also some other politicians, because it seems that to a large extent this emperor actually has no clothes. Yeah? What would they like to do? Go with Russia at the same time? So it all doesn't really work out very well. Or you dissolve just all coalitions without a good alternative. I mean, that also cannot be a very serious option. The European public, I believe, can be convinced, and maybe we should be stronger in trying that actually the European alliance needs strength. And that is true for the foreign and defense policy. But it's also very true, as Ivan already mentioned, for digitalization. And that is actually the policy I've been working in during the past 1 year or 1 year and a half. And it's tremendous how much of a need there actually is for a definition of EU-level positions. We simply cannot go either with the surveillance system imposed by the Communist Party system in China, and we also, I believe, do not want to go with the surveillance system imposed by the US. So much on that. And to end on a maybe slightly more positive note, this picture of foreign policy as a zero-sum game is a dangerous one, and I agree it's a very strong one, and I agree we should go beyond it. Let me mention a concept that Frank Schiebel-Fennig has developed, and we're on a special issue project there where I try to contribute from the viewpoint of EU digitalization policy. And I believe it's a strong framework because it's very telling and it has a strong imaginary involved. So he speaks about bordering and brings up debordering that has been very common in European integration for decades. And he also talks about rebordering, and in a more neutral sense than maybe this de-Europeanization label or concept is. And he has a very nice four-field table, because you can think at the same time about the internal frontiers and the external frontiers. And if you think about debordering, let's take the internal market, bringing down these borders was a very major enterprise. At the same time, in the following period, we had a lot of debordering also with economic globalization. However, if you add debordering on one level to debordering on another level, what may possibly result is what Frank called dilutive integration. Meaning that one could end up in a situation where there are almost no borders, and it's hence very difficult, if the borders get more troubling, then to achieve a kind of stability. If, on the other hand, you combine an internal debordering with an external rebordering, you could end up with a very viable system of what he calls effective integration. If I think about the digital sphere, where clearly a digital internal market is something the European Commission also has been striving for, if at the same time we have no borders whatsoever on the level of technology, and what happens then is that we actually in the near future can't guarantee a kind of security on the level of these technologies and maybe even basic infrastructures. That is something where clearly dangers will be felt by the population, and it might in the end undermine the situation as it is. So I think maybe if we adopt that kind of a bit more, I don't know, as neutral is maybe overdoing it, but it's a terminology where having some changes is not necessarily a detriment to European integration. It may be about recalibration, yeah? But in the long run, one could end up with more Europeanization if it's well thought through and if it's well argued. And so I think it's at least worthwhile to think and discuss this. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to join you for the discussion again.
I am thrilled to join this discussion. And I suppose the main reason why I am standing here is that I happen to come from a country where we have a radical right-wing populist party in government, which suddenly makes Estonia a very interesting case study in our today's discussion. And I must say, for my generation of, I consider myself a liberal part of the Estonian society, it has been quite a shock that we experienced in Estonia this sudden rise of radical right-wing populist party, and that this ended then with this party actually coming to power as one member of a coalition government consisting of 3 parties. So what I will do in my remarks is first to try to look a bit into the reasons why this happened, the reasons that are both internal and external. They are domestic, they are European, they are global, and this internal and external is really intertwined. And actually I will go back in time to begin with and look at the moment when Estonia was joining the European Union as part of the so-called Big Bang enlargement in 2004. Enlargement has been often called the most successful part of EU foreign policy, and the EU has been praised a lot for promoting democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. But in my own PhD thesis that I wrote many years ago and completed just when Estonia was joining the EU, I was looking at the impact of the EU on the democratization of Eastern candidate countries. And my main conclusion was not that positive only. Namely, I was arguing back then that although the EU did promote democratic reforms, the process of integration, the way it happened, actually left little room for democratic politics, and it constrained the quality of democracy. Let me quote a publication, one of my first academic articles from that time. Integration into the EU was constructed as a matter of fast and efficient expert work and the implementation of inevitabilities, rather than a process involving political debate and choice. Relying on bureaucratic expert work, the logic of enlargement depoliticized matters of judgment and choice. And since the EU valued and rewarded fast and efficient expert work on the side of the candidate states, it was often useful and rational from the viewpoint of officials and leading politicians of the latter to present any EU-related decisions as inevitable. This saved the time and energy that broader deliberation of alternative solutions would have required. The inclusion of Parliament and civil society complicated and slowed down that work. Now jumping back to this day, looking at the rise of populism in Estonia and in Central and Eastern Europe more broadly, I think we can see the legacy of that process. And so we have today Estonia as an example of how a radical right-wing populist party shakes and tests the democratic system. And we have a political debate that at times seems to lose any connection to notions such as rationality or responsibility or decency. It's not only, of course, a Central and Eastern European phenomenon. And the same issue was at the center of the Munich Security Conference discussions a couple of weeks ago, under the title of Westlessness, referring to this development where liberal democracy is challenged by national conservative right-wing populists propagating so-called illiberal democracies in many countries. Looking at Brexit and Trump, it is obvious that it is not just a Central and Eastern European phenomenon. However, why the success of such parties has been stronger in several of the Central and Eastern European countries, I think has to do with the fact that these are young democracies and that the weaknesses and mistakes of the West, the liberal democratic West, have found a particularly fruitful ground for the rise of populism in this part of Europe. Looking at explanations to the rise of populism, in general there are two broad factors that are highlighted. One is social inequality and feeling of social injustice, and the other is identity politics, concern about the dilution of national identity or sometimes Western identity. And both, of course, have to do with globalization. The first was really made very strong by the global financial crisis started in 2008. The second, concern about identity, was provoked a lot by the migration crisis in Europe in 2015. And in the case of Estonia, for example, it was the migration crisis that really gave this decisive push to the radical right-wing populism. But still, I think we have more work to do in kind of understanding why is it that liberal democracy as a system has found it so hard to come to terms with this crisis, to deal with these problems of social inequality and of responding to people's fears about loss of identity and fears about the consequences of migration. And I think here again we come to this problem of politics becoming as a series of inevitabilities rather than making choices. This is an argument that often left-wing thinkers have been making. For example, political philosopher Chantal Mouffe was writing about democratic politics many years ago, pointing to this danger that lack of pluralism and lack of antagonistic disputes can be dangerous for democracy. But I don't think it is a particularly left-wing argument as such. And what the populist parties are doing, and the right wing also, is to then protest against this liberal elite that seems to know all the right answers and always propose the inevitable decisions to be taken. Of course, Ivan Krastev has written about similar development as imitation, and indeed, this is what Estonia and others went through in the 1990s. imitating the laws and norms and institutions and ways of doing things, anything from beauty contests to renovating apartments. We have this concept of Evermont and so on. So a lot of imitation, but ironically today we are also imitating actually populism. Today what our populists are doing, they are imitating President Donald Trump, and they are very open about it. Donald Trump is a source of inspiration for them, and they see Donald Trump as an embodiment of the change that is going on in the West, fundamental change, from liberal to illiberal democracy. So this is I think, the outcome of a long process that indeed goes back to the transition period and the post-Cold War era, which is today over. And let me now come closer to foreign policy and reflect on some of the consequences that these developments are having for foreign policy of Estonia and of the European Union, and maybe for the EU as a whole and even the Western world. But starting from Estonia, my institute just conducted a study that analyzed the image and influence of Estonia in the European Union. And it would be a very nice story of diplomatic adaptation and successfully finding your way in the foreign policy making of the European Union without this factor of the rise of populism, which is quite recent, so it is a bit too early to draw any strong conclusions about the degree of impact that this has had on Estonia's position and influence and image in the EU. But some signs are already there about partners having new doubts and questions about what kind of member state Estonia is, because we have contradicting messages coming from different members of government. We can see erosion of foreign policy consensus and consensus on EU policy matters that used to be there earlier over many years. So for a small peripheral member state, I think this is quite a dangerous development. Secondly, even more serious implication is that I sense that Estonia is becoming more vulnerable to external threats because of the political polarization that we have within the society and because of the erosion of consensus on some of the very fundamental choices of foreign policy. Then looking more broadly at the European Union, it's obvious that with this kind of member states, it becomes more difficult for the EU to reach collective decisions on many issues. And what is, I think, most worrying is that the foundation of shared values, which has been the basis of the EU and NATO and the Western community, is eroding. And these institutions, which have been so crucial for Estonia and other countries in the region, they are becoming more volatile. And this is happening at the time when the geopolitical environment globally is becoming so much more conflictual and demanding. And indeed, I share the previous speaker's point that we have moved from this kind of idea that we can have a win-win world to a zero-sum world, where great powers are competing, and where the European Union actually does not have the tools to take part in that kind of competition. It has started to talk about becoming more geopolitical, but it does not really have neither the kind of strategic thinking nor the actual tools in terms of military capabilities and other capabilities to operate in such a world on a par with other major players. So this is the rather kind of pessimistic conclusion that I end with. I think that one of the questions we may wish to debate is whether liberal democracy in Europe could still be capable of providing the kind of framework for the contestation that populism has created, and whether we can still try to deal with the new kinds of conflicts and maintain the framework of liberal democracy, which is again closely connected to whether we can maintain liberal order internationally in the sense of having a norms-based global order. We see that many populists in Europe are embracing the world that is more realist and more protectionist and more focused on national sovereignty. But do they have the answers of how to cope in this kind of world? And then we, as a very final point, comment on the transatlantic relationship, which has been, of course, one of the cornerstones of Estonia and other countries in the region and of European security as a whole. I think it is slowly kind of recognized in our region, in the Baltic countries, Poland, Nordic countries, that we need to get ready for the US at some point in future abandoning Europe, abandoning European security. But at the same time, we are still trying to do everything we can to avoid contributing ourselves to this kind of development. And this is a really difficult balance to maintain. And I will end here.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for all these insights to the speakers. And I think I have forgotten to introduce myself. My name is Patrick Müller. I'm a professor here at the Diplomatic Academy and Vienna University. We had many workshops, many dinners, and many events, so I have introduced myself so many times. I think I forgot it tonight, so I wanted not to skip that. I think for me there's so much that has been said that triggers a lot of questions, but I will soon open up to the audience just a few observations. I think it was very interesting, Ivan, when you talked about kind of the European Union being locked in, in its liberal foreign policy discourse, and what kind of tensions this can cause in a world that's changing, and the European Union then being, of course, very much about inertia and not much flexibility, so it's difficult to see how it could respond to it also in a discourse that's shifting. And then with Gerda's presentation, I would be really interested to use the data that you collected and then compare it not to how do different right-wing populist parties position themselves in terms of do they agree on issues or not, but rather how do they stand according to the foreign policy mainstream in their own countries, because that would give us a very good idea. Are they really led by notions of national interest and expertise, or is there something changing? And I think that also connects me a bit to then what Christy said, and I also think it's very interesting and sometimes sad when your country becomes a case study, or something, maybe also something that you don't like so much. But I think in foreign policy, difference matters a lot. When you find these parties are very different, it doesn't mean then we don't have a problem because they cannot agree on much and they cannot shift Europe. But in European foreign policy, which is so consensus-based and intergovernmental, differences and new differences can really deadlock the system and can make it very difficult for the system to respond to key challenges that the European Union is facing at the international level on many issues. So I think it might be also interesting to see, well, how how do they position themselves to the mainstream in the country to establish national interests, what is shifting, and then again, like Christy, like you alluded, it can become much more difficult to reach policies in the first place at the European level, and that would be also very interesting to observe. We're working at the moment on a special issue where we're looking in some of these questions, and I think there's much to do. But now I would like to open up the floor, and maybe could I ask one DA students, because you're always so active and participatory, to take the mic that's lying here on the microphone. Would anybody volunteer from you? And then we have a mic for the speakers. Anybody who volunteers, would you like to volunteer? They were wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. So this is how you get recruited on a harmless evening in Vienna. Okay. Here we have the mic.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed every presentation of yours. And here's my question. Daphne Helikopoulos, a professor in England of comparative politics, stated that if the 2010s were the years in which predominantly European far-right populist parties permeated the political mainstream, then the 2020s will be when voters are going to see the consequences of that. So I have two questions. Do you agree with this statement in timing? And which EU country, from your perspectives, will be the first to realize the consequences of policy of far-right populist parties? Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Krasnov. I also have a question regarding the 5G technology that you have mentioned. As we know that the EU has a very fierce debate of whether to bring the 5G technology made by Huawei or other Asian companies. So, do you really think that bringing technology like Huawei would jeopardize EU's cybersecurity? And how come this kind of bringing new technologies have correlation with EU's populism trend?
My name is Salvador Manchavaria. I'm my school. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. And my question is related to the EU foreign policy related to migration. And I was thinking, considering the rise of populism and the fact that currently many migration policies of like many European states are against integration or like are based on our borders. Do you think there is a possibility of European intervention which could be more in line with basic human values? So like more different, like more prone to integration and acceptance of migrants. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rafaela Tiefenbacher. I'm also from MAIS2, a student here. So when reading or really listening to the foreign policy discourse, it seems as if the migration debate really has completely overtaken the foreign policy, security policy debate. So the securization of migration is a way to show one's military strength and might, and therefore a good way for right-wing parties to engage in what might in other countries be an equivalent to warmongering. I would like to know your view on this issue. And then my second question is, I find it peculiar that we have heard a lot about right-wing extreme parties, yet the most shining examples and role models to these parties are all representatives of conservative parties. So when we speak about Boris Johnson, when we speak about Donald Trump, but also really when we speak about European conservatives who oppose prolonging Sophia, for example. To what extent can we really only look at right-wing extremist parties here, and do we not kind of cut off the discourse where it actually gets problematic?
All right, so let's cut it here, and then we can have a second round of questions, and maybe we'll answer in the reverse order of how we spoke. So would you start, Christine, with questions that you feel related to you?
Okay, if I may pick and choose. some of the questions. Thank you very much. All were very relevant questions. I will start from the migration issue. I'm not sure if migration has taken over foreign policy debate. I find migration is an issue that has been maybe the most difficult one to have debate on at all. Kind of reasonable debate where we have exchange of views and arguments being made and counter arguments. We have a situation where we have the radical populists making their claims about migration, which often have not so much to do with any reality on the ground, especially in such Eastern European countries where we almost have no refugees or asylum seekers, but we have this very noisy voice of populist right-wing parties who keep talking about the threat of mass migration, as if it is still something that will reach us soon unless we stop EU integration and unless we do more to stop the borders and unless we follow the example of Viktor Orban, who has been the only politician in Europe who actually seriously addresses the issue. And then what is the other side of the debate? I don't see that much of it, because it's not something that, let's say, the more mainstream parties would feel very comfortable discussing, and that's probably part of the problem. And you asked about the traditional conservative parties. Indeed, we can see that many of the traditional national conservatives have actually shifted very close to the right-wing populists on some issues, including migration, partly as a tactical move to kind of, in the hope of losing voters to the radical right, which does not seem to work that well as a tactics. But I think that's also more generally becoming a problem with discussing the European Union, that we have the noisy extreme, but then very little response from the mainstream to try to kind of provide counter-arguments, because it is so difficult to have an argument with the radical parties whose style is not about rationality, it's about emotions, it's about being provocative, it's about getting attention and not about having an argument. Then there was a question on technologies such as Huawei. If I understood the question correctly, it was about whether these foreign origin technologies really are dangerous, whether they are a threat. And here I think I can present the kind of viewpoint of the traditional foreign policy establishment, which is increasingly seeing this issue as a potential threat. And this has to do with this issue of globalization and interconnectedness and interdependence suddenly not being such a nice phenomenon as it was during the post-Cold War era. Now, in today's world of great power competition and contestation between different kinds of major powers and also the level of values, we actually start to see the technological connection and dependencies on external powers, major external powers, as vulnerability. Because they do provide the possibility for these external major powers to have political influence. It is a possibility that Huawei, for example, would be used as a tool. It's something that is kind of speculative at this point. but it has to be taken seriously. Does it connect to populism? I think that was also part of the question. As far as I know, most of the populist parties are rather not worried about these kind of issues and are rather more welcoming to foreign investment and engagement coming from authoritarian powers such as Russia and China. And this is part of this inconsistency of positions of the populist parties, that they kind of embrace the new realist world without really thinking through the consequences. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a lot I actually agree with. And there is a lot of questions where I don't have the one convincing answer in the sense of a magic wand or recipe or so. Yeah? Not for the migration issue, not for other securitization, but in general terms, I would like to repeat the issue of the emperor's clothes, because actually my feeling is that one should be much more open about the absence of adequate clothes in many of the so-called role models of our times. I mean, what do other countries, right-wing populists, want to be? Millionaires like Donald Trump? Blatantly lying like people in the Brexit campaign? We should call them bluff more often. So that's one thing I feel should. So this tendency to be afraid and to be kind of fascinated should make more room for a kind of more lightness and more frankness in how shocking many of these styles actually are. But yeah, that's also no easy recipe. But coming back to the issues where I'm closer to some social science research I'm doing, I would like to take up the hooray question as well, because we are so blatantly dependent on our digital infrastructures nowadays that I start wondering how actually politicians can think that it's not dangerous if non- or anti-democratic states or other opponents have the possibility to switch us off, to blackout us. Yeah. I mean, this is unthinkable, in fact, and it should become the core security concern, and I believe it will in the years to come. But we may be, frankly, quite late in rethinking these issues. And we shouldn't rethink them only vis-a-vis the case, and I don't repeat the name. We should rethink them also with regards to the United States. We've had enough whistleblowers telling us that there is not enough control in that system either, and it hasn't improved under Donald Trump. If you want to read 5 pages piece, journalistic piece, but really revealing about digitalization and where we stand, I recommend the piece of 19th of December of the New York Times. And the title is One Nation Tracked. There was a leak of one of the economic firms that collect all of our data all of the time, and there was a data leak, and so they got some of the usual longitudinal geodata of normal mobile phones. And they show how easy it is, without any basic expertise, to find out who is who Because there's only one person moving between your bed and your office every day. And that's the same for the US president. And if you start tracking the phones at some major meeting of the US president with some other major politicians, you have the phone signals of their phones and their entourage. Yeah? And you can use that data for all kinds of purposes. It's not only about malevolent other states or competitor states or systems, so to say. It's also about terrorism, but it's also about simple blackmailing. Think about the possibilities of people working for the secret services and so easily, so easily known by name nowadays with all of their whereabouts. And it may be a simple stop at, I don't know, a self-help group for depression. It may be a stop at some hospital for alcoholism, whatever you name it. And it may not be there, but their family and. I think we are much too far along that road, and it's already very dangerous. And I think that the topic should really, really be taken serious now, basically. And the other thing that is as pressing is the issue of democracy. I mean, look at our kids nowadays being psychologically really dependent on what goes on the internet. This is not just fun anymore. No kid can go offline for a longer time without showing sick symptoms. Yeah? And think about how that will all progress in the next years to come. Think about all of the nudging that is ongoing. Think about the scandals that Facebook openly says they influenced thousands of people in the pre-last elections in the United States just to try if they can do it. Yes, they can do it. And others can do it for money. And it's being done all the time. And what does it mean for our democracy? The individual voter is nudged, is made psychologically dependent. Yeah? The elections are in part steered, manipulated, at some point faked. We are the subject of misinformation all the time already. And the economy is in digital times also transforming tremendously. We have to think that it's a few major firms who own basically all of the data nowadays. It makes them so powerful now. But that's not the main problem. The main problem is that only those few firms are actually in a pole position for developing artificial intelligence. So try to make up your mind how powerful they will be in 5 years' time. And these are all issues that go so directly to the matter of democracy that I think we can't take it seriously enough, actually. And I'll stop here.
Probably it's my turn, nevertheless, the moderator is not here. I'll start with the first question about the consequences. And I do believe that the professor that you quoted is right. For a very simple reason. I don't believe that the influence of the populist party should be defined simply by their results on the elections. The major influence is how you're changing other parties. And in a certain way, they're changing the agenda as a whole. And from this point of view, even if the populist parties are not going to outperform on the elections, it does not mean that they're not going to influence our politics. And something that it was said by the previous speakers, the consensual type of politics to which we have been very much used to, in a certain way, is over. The level of political polarization, and you're seeing this in different places. The very understanding of democracy that the biggest threat for the democracy if the other party is going to win. I do believe this is already a major change, because this is changing basically the way the decisions are taken. And also, concerning the foreign policy position of the populist parties, which I know that Austrian colleagues knows much better because she has been studying it much more carefully. Interestingly enough, in most of the cases, they simply are the extreme version of a position, of the prevailing position of the current domestic consensus. For example, in Italy, position to Russia is generally friendly, like in Austria. So the Lega is not kind of an opposite to this consensus, but basically the extreme version of this. Hungary is a very specific case because of a very specific leader. But for example, Austria was also the case. So from this point of view, it's not that Freedom Party is the pro-Russian party, while everybody else is an anti-Russian party in Austria. The problem is that they go and start to challenge the major European consensus of how far you can go. And I do believe this is true also on the other side, for example, in Poland or other countries in which the consensus is very much strongly anti-Russian, and some of these parties basically are not becoming pro-Russian, but they're becoming even more anti-Russian than this. So from this point of view, one of the effects of the populist parties is going to be the much more extreming of the existing prevailing kind of attitudes in certain countries, which is going to make much more difficult for the European Union to come with common positions. Because before you're basically making certain concessions, you're agreeing on certain limits. And then going to the Huawei story. And listen, this is a much more important story because this is the border, this is the question about the border between the commercial and the security. For sure, you have a reason to be concerned. By the way, Huawei was a company created by the People's Liberation Army. Of course. Yeah. So from this point of view, this is not the case. The case is that for the Europeans, basically banning Huawei is also not a low-cost exercise. It basically means that most probably China is going to retaliate, and the major result is going to be major losses for certain other European businesses, particularly for the German auto companies. So from this point of view, nobody is discussing that they're going to be a security effect. The biggest problem is what we're trading for. And if before the European Union was trying to desecuritize any type of commercial relations, and this is particularly strong in the case of Germany, because the more you're an export country, the more you're trying to claim that the security issues are not the most important. Now this is changing dramatically, and this is changing dramatically not only on the American or European side. For example, in the case of Russia, you have a term of digital sovereignty. Basically, the Russian government was clear that they're not going to allow any type of major Western technologies to be critical for their infrastructure. So from this point of view, for me, this is the most important point on this. European security is based on the assumptions that economic interdependency decreases the risk of war. And by the way, historians have been doing a lot of study on this, and their claim was, this is true if both sides have a positive trade expectations. But if do not have a positive trade expectations, then the economic interdependency increases the risk of war. So from this point of view, we moved to one assumption to another, and for the European Union, this is a radical change. So from this point of view, it's not about one company. And I'm just going to make one more remark on this point. Also, the problem of technology, Huawei in general, and you don't believe Huawei is not simply the relations between Europe and China. There is a very strong message coming from the American side that if Europeans decided to adopt these technologies, this is going basically to prevent the Americans sharing any type of intelligence information. So from this point of view, this is a squeeze. So this is not a situation in which Europeans basically make an abstract kind of a power-free value judgments on the situation. And the interesting story is that the European Commission comes with a story that made it for the member states to decide exactly how they're going to define it, which is a strange story. For example, even the level of ambiguity is very high. For example, the German consensus for the moment is that our infrastructure should relate on trustworthy companies. But I do believe that different players has a very different definition of what trustworthy is. And then we go to the migration issue. And the migration issue is critical also for the European Union for 3 points of view. One is, just some years ago, one of the major claims of the European Union about the attractiveness of the soft power of the European Union was that everybody wants to live like us. But the dark side is that probably everybody wants to come to us. So suddenly the European Union now starts to feel its own soft power. And this is why the discourse on migration in a certain way is also highly hypocritical on all sides. You're right about the major center-right parties, but let's tell you on migration, you're also not going to see a major difference between positions that otherwise looks very different. When it talks about the strengthening of the external borders, there is no major difference between Mr. Orban and President Macron. This is, part of the story is that you have the feeling that basically there are those who claim for open borders and those who claim for closed borders. Paradoxically, both positions are impossible and they are not there. There is not a major political party in Europe which is advocating an open borders. And there is basically no sane person who believes that you can simply close the borders. So the real problem of the European Union is that the official discourse is we don't want labor migrants, but we are open for refugees. And the truth is just the opposite. We're interested in labor migrants, and we're not interested in refugees, because the major story about the labor migrants is that you can select, and second, you don't feel moral obligations. So from this point of view, the position of the political parties is quite interesting, because also depending in which country you are, these same populist parties that have a very strong common position against migration, because this is one of the major kind of common ground for the anti-migration parties, they very much agree on the general statement, we don't want migrants. But then between Mr. Salvini and Mr. Orban, they have a major difference what to do with the migrants who are already in Italy. Should they stay in Italy? Or should some of them go to the other EU member states? As you can imagine, Mr. Salvini believes that they should go to some of the other EU member states, and Mr. Orban is not particularly excited about this. So from this point of view, I do believe this is quite important, because, and this is my last point on migration. The interesting story also about migration is that it is challenging the European project at its very core. Because if you go historically, after the World War I, the major idea of how you can get peace in Europe is you're creating a new states, you're creating border, with the idea to create a kind of a different constellations that is going to prevent war. After World War II, the idea was we try to change the borders as least as possible, but we're moving people, in order to create a much more ethnically homogeneous community, which then was believed are going to basically be guarantee for peace. After the Cold War, the idea was we're not changing the borders, and we're not forcefully moving the people. What we're going to change is the nature of the borders. So hard budgets and soft borders was the formula of the EU. And suddenly, the problem of the migration, and by the way, also the technology problem, is asking the nature of the borders again. And this is why migration is a problem for everybody. I mean, how you're dealing with this, but for the European Union, it has totally different meaning, because the defining nature of the European Union is its definition of borders. Internal borders, but also external borders. Don't forget, the European Union was the only great power which consciously claimed that we don't know where our borders are. Because we have been always claiming that we are bordering future member states.
Thank you so much. So we would have time for about 3 more questions, and I would like to ask people who ask questions to ask one question and rather brief. Okay, we have a couple of more, so I collect them, and then we see. Hopefully there will be some overlap. Okay. So where should I start? Should I start with the gentleman here?
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting presentations. My name is Martino Levatera. I'm a former student of this academy. I actually will have 3 questions, but I only stick to 1 now because of the time. I think the most pressing for me would be for you, Mrs. Reich, especially because I had a bit the feeling that you were quite critical the EU and its, so to say, embrace of your country. So, do you think that, for example, an introduction of a qualified majority vote would be a way forward concerning Europeans' foreign politics? Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Knut Erik, you had a question? Yes, maybe.
My name is Knut Erik Hansen, Aarhus University. And I would also like to thank the panel for some very smart interventions. I enjoyed them tremendously. Actually, I don't have a question, I have a proposition I would like to test on the panel.
All right.
And it begins with the often seen situation that a football team performs wonderfully, and for one single reason, that the other team allows it to do so. So my proposition is about this team that allows the other team to perform wonderfully. And I think this team is the European centrist party, collectively speaking, the liberal centrist that is imploding. And what is it that this centrist position has to offer, and has offered Europeans for quite some time? Well, I guess 1/3 of the centrist party has offered globalization without realizing that globalization undermines that embedded liberalism that secured some social peace and some balance between open borders and some protection against sort of the most negative effects. Another third of the centrist position mistakes liberal politics for corporate governance. And I guess most of us who come from universities have felt the effects of being exposed to corporate governance instead of liberal politics. The final third reduces the liberal project to identity politics. And I think this is a very sort of fair summary of what is offered. And that is the reason, I guess, that the populist far right performs so relatively well these days.
Thanks a lot, Derek, and you even managed not to ask more than one question. No, but it was very important intervention, I think. And I think you also had a question.
Thanks. I would have more than one question. Right. At the moment when we are sitting here, there's something taking place at the Kreisky Forum. There's a professor here from Jena who differentiates between populist parties and rightist dictatorial parties. Populist parties, Johnson, Trump. Okay? Rightist dictatorial parties, he claims, being a professor from Jena, come through the erosion of Russia. Which means when we have Lega, when we have now the split in the Austrian Freedom Party, one might be populist, the other might be dictatorial rightist. Same story with Le Pen. I'm in South France, I know what's going on there. Very strong against Macron, etc. I heard the first time about their Estonian sample. Do you think that your Estonian rightist party is also due to Russian undermining your country? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I see now two more questions, three more questions. It's getting too many. Okay, so I would give you the floor and I would give you the floor and back, and then we would have to close it. Yeah, gentleman here and then come back.
Thank you very much. Saito, Vienna University. So my question is whether the European Union with member states governed by populist governments or populist parties strengthens or enhance the EU positioning in the world politics, and I add that such an EU weaken the position of European Union as well as the populist government exists in European Union because the EU lacks in credibility. So because how European Union credibly persuade other countries like Western Balkans to take democracy, rule of law, or human rights, whether EU or EU member states cannot or doesn't commit to such fundamental values. Thank you very much.
Hello, good evening. My name is Roxana Tompen. I'm a student at the Academy. I have a question for you, Mr. Speaker. You mentioned soft borders, hard budget, is that right? I was thinking in the context of technology and digital tools, could that be used as a currency for Eastern European countries and Baltic countries to compensate the power struggle within the EU? Thank you.
All right, so we just keep passing the orders maybe as we had it. Christy, would you like to start again? And let's try to be rather brief. Thank you so much.
Let me actually start with the question on the views of Estonian Populist Party on Russia. And Estonia fits perfectly to this description that Ivan Krastev was just providing about populist parties on Russia taking, in a way, similar view to the mainstream, but a more extreme version of the mainstream. So in the Estonian case, where the mainstream view on Russia is critical and Russia is always seen as an existential threat for Estonia, and it is the focus of the security policy of Estonia to find ways to defend the country vis-à-vis that threat. So the Populist Party then takes an extremely critical view on Russia, more critical than the mainstream, and more antagonistic than the mainstream, and also more extreme on certain specific issues. And here is one example of how the populist parties erode consensus on core foreign policy issues, consensus that has been there for many, many years before, and now it is broken. Namely, they take a position on the Estonian-Russian border treaty that the treaty should not be signed. I mean, it has been negotiated, but it has not been ratified. So it is waiting for ratification. It has been waiting for many years because the Russian side has not been willing to do it. But now we have a government in Estonia that includes a party that says the border treaty should not be signed. Because the border that is established now is different from the border that was established when Estonia first gained independence just over 100 years ago. At that time, the territory was slightly larger, and when the Soviet occupation came during the Second World War, after that, the border was moved westwards. So there are territories that used to be part of Estonia between the two world wars, but are now part of Russia.
And as we see, the current case, international law is not going to be really kept by Russia, right?
Sure, but I mean
so
here,
then?
well, you can of course make that argument, but the argument that Estonian foreign policy has been making for all these years is that for a small state, the aim is to have an international order that is based on rules and norms and agreements, and it is in the interest of a small state to promote this kind of international order, and with your own actions not to undermine the rules-based order. But suddenly this consensus is no longer so obvious, and these are of course very fundamental issues, and to have then this consensus eroding, I think it really makes the country more vulnerable, and it has consequences for many of the kind of core positions of foreign policy, and it raises questions among partners and allies about what the positions actually are, and is Estonia suddenly making territorial claims to Russia, or what is happening? Of course, the government as such is not making territorial claims. The government has not changed its position collectively, but you have very different views within government. What is also interesting about the populists and their views on Russia, in one aspect, the populist party in Estonia is similar to many other European populists, and that is the kind of course, this conservative values, conservative family values, this ethno-nationalism. This is something that kind of resonates quite well, actually, with the policies of Russia and national conservative values.
Very quick, I would ask you to wrap up, and maybe let me make a proposition before we ask, because we have a reception then in the adjacent room, so there will be plenty of opportunity to maybe approach the speaker and discuss things in more depth. But now I would like to ask you to be very brief, because the people from the kitchen, they are waiting for us, and they're getting a bit desperate next door. Let's be brief. I will be brief myself.
Let's continue on Russia later. Just a couple of words on the qualified majority vote question. And if I sounded critical towards the EU, I think it's a criticism of someone who would actually want the EU to function better and to survive and to be able to take decisions. Could qualified majority vote in foreign policy be a step towards better capability of the EU to have an effective foreign policy, I have big doubts. Because the challenge is that we don't have a shared strategic culture, we don't have a shared understanding of threat perceptions, we find it very difficult to establish common foreign policy positions in the EU. And if you then bring qualified majority vote procedure into this equation, you end up kind of magnifying this lack of unity, and you make it an even larger problem. What is the credibility of foreign policy decisions in the EU if they are opposed by a minority of member states who then will not implement these decisions? Can we imagine, let's say, sanctions imposed by the EU, that some of the member states say, we don't agree and we are not going to implement these sanctions? So this would not be a way, in my view, to have a more effective EU foreign policy.
Thank you. Okay, Gerda, please very briefly.
Many interesting and smart things have been said, and I just pick up one thing, that is Knut Erik's comment that the centrists implode, and this is why the populists perform so well, and I think there is much to it. I would like to extend the argument on the level of topics, of focuses in public life. And I think this is also a main problem. I think that a lot of the topics that have actually been dramatized during the past years actually take away our attention from other topics that should be taken more seriously. And so, for example, I would expect that after the first major blackout, when people have experienced how our supply chains break down after 2 days, they will realize that actually, even in 2015, when we had comparatively most asylum seekers, I mean, if you calculate the numbers for Austria, only each village of 5,000 people would have had to integrate one family. I think people will rethink how traumatic that really was, and I think it was exactly the populists that could take a lot of attention because somehow it was allowed in the media, in the public, that this topic got so overwhelming. And I think we should be very quick now to refocus, and I think it would be a good idea for the European Union to make something that could maybe call digital humanism or something like that, to take it very serious, to consider a kind of rebordering, but a well thought through form, and not panicking form, and a not anti-humanist kind of form of it, but try to find a kind of third way, try to find a model that is compatible with democracy and human rights. And I think that could be a very big agenda that could draw a positive kind of attention, and that could give Europe a positive kind of energy back. And I think it's of deterring our always watching some topics that also favors the populist right.
Thank you. And now, very brief.
I'll try to be very brief, and also I cannot come even for the cocktail because my son is back home, but alone. But first, I very much agree with you. I think that political scientists made the same mistake that the economists did before the financial crisis. We start to pretend that we're beyond boost and bust, that you can narrow public choices to a certain type of reasonable options that you have defined. And the interesting story is that, of course, populism came as a reaction to the consensual politics, but populism is going to create its own kind of discontent. So the interesting question for me is how the post-populist movement looks like. What are going to be the parties which also come out of the disappointment? And then comes, of course, the important story about Russia. The interesting story about Russia is much more betting on disrupting and creating divisiveness within the political countries than betting on a certain party. So from this point of view, even the division between good populist and dictatorial rightists and so on, it's not the problem of intention, but the problem of capacity. Nobody is going to understand what happened in Hungary if he does not keep in mind that simply Mr. Orban ended up with a constitutional majority. When you have a constitutional majority, you can do things that you otherwise you cannot do. So from a certain point of view, there are certain parties who looks very vegetarian simply because they are not strong enough. This is not the kind of a border that cannot be easily crossed. And my last interesting story about Russia is, nevertheless, that we are focused on the Russian influence, I'm going to end up with one fact. For all these years, even when the populist parties entered European governments, including in this country, never a single member state vetoed the common sanction policies on Russia, which is particularly sensitive for the Russian side. At the same time, Chinese government twice managed to organize EU member states to veto China unfriendly policy. So from this point of view, who is more influential is a question open. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's not easy to finish a panel like this on a positive note, but I think the positive note would be that next door we have now a reception. So I hope that I will see you all there. And then for the project members, we have lunch. Thank you very much for attending, and I think it was positive.